Rather than living our lives, we are lived by unknown and uncontrollable forces. Sigmund Freud. The idea that we can never truly control our own minds is at the cornerstone of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. And as we saw in previous videos, there's ample research to suggest that thoughts, memory, behavior, and other senses are more amenable to outside forces than we would like to think. Now, no matter how you cut it, psychoanalytic theory, modern-day research, and personal experience all tell us that two things are undeniably true. The first is that pain is real. The second is that we try whatever way we can to eliminate it, and that is where defense mechanisms come in. Now, I've already explained in a previous video the principles behind defense mechanisms and how they function. But one of these mechanisms in particular best encapsulates what it actually is to be a defense mechanism and symbolizes one of the basic precepts of the whole idea, and that is the process of repression. Repression is the ego's means of keeping ideas which are distressing or incompatible with it out of consciousness. This quote by Anna Freud not only defines repression, but it also perfectly captures the central component of psychoanalysis itself, which is to say there's a complex subconscious process that's taking place that's keeping distressful content outside conscious awareness. And repression is the mechanism through which this happens, as once again our subconscious mind is actively preventing distressing material to come to the surface. In psychoanalytic theory, repression has been linked to emotional and mental health issues, maladaptive behavioral patterns, relationship difficulties, and even physical and psychosomatic symptoms such as headaches, fatigue, muscle tension, sleep problems, and the like. But these maladaptive elements are more so linked to the idea that you're not actually repressing them authentically, but may more so be deliberately making an attempt not to think about the distressing material. Because once again, the idea of repression is that it's unconscious, and therefore, the distressing material does not make its way into your conscious mind, so you do not actually have to make a deliberate attempt to not think about it. It's basically like saying when you give a performance and you're humiliated, a part of your brain prevents you from either remembering the event itself or the feelings associated with it. Now, this is where the context is very important, because it can be good or bad, right? Like, it's not a bad thing to forget about, humiliating experiences or things that make you uncomfortable, necessarily. But it can become bad when the process of not thinking about things or not remembering things inhibits you from learning a lesson that you desperately need to know. And the same can be said about desires, as sometimes totally avoiding them can be good or bad. But again, the context is important, right? Because who's to say if it's good or bad? Maybe you're just stopping yourself from doing the next big thing, right? Like, who knows? But we can break down these definitions so that they make more sense to us. The ego is not master in its own house. It is subject to the influences of the unconscious and employs defense mechanisms such as repression without being aware of them. Now, the reason I choose this quote is because it perfectly encapsulates one of the cornerstones of the nature of repression, which is that it's an unconscious mechanism. In psychoanalytic theory, it's also seen as a normal and healthy function of the human mind that we would not be able to function without. If we were stripped of this ability, it would lead to an uncontrollable decline in mental functioning and something akin to unmanageable behavioral outbursts. Now, being an unconscious process, that means repression has some unique manifestations on people who are oftentimes finding themselves as repressors. And this can manifest in a variety of ways, but you can generalize them under two basic precepts. The first is that repressors are generally emotionally avoidant, and the second one is that people who habitually use repression are often disconnected with a part of themselves. Now, these factors influence outcomes in habitual repressors, and there are studies that provide credible evidence to support that claim. Some have suggested that those who fall into that category tend to have high reports on their capacity for things like intimacy, self-esteem, and self-control, compared to those who use other coping strategies. In a study on defensiveness, Dr. Daniel Weinberger found evidence which correlated with this hypothesis and noted that habitual repressors scored high on defensiveness but low on anxiety, which suggests that repression itself may actually more fully disconnect us from our anxiety, and this can be a high-quality way to deal with our problems. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's take a minute to talk about if repression is real. Because as you'll come to find out, this is actually a pretty controversial topic in the world of psychology. And the reason why is because of memories. Now, the whole idea of repression rests on the merit that your memory is filtered by a subconscious process. And as a result of this, they're outside of conscious awareness until they're brought out in something like therapy. But there's a problem, which is that memories are reconstructive, fallible, and easily altered. And it's not a secret either, as multiple studies across decades have demonstrated this in blatant ways, such as when things are worded differently, we remember things differently. One famous study by Loftus and Palmer did an excellent job portraying this dynamic by simply using subtle differences in framing regarding a car crash. Participants watched videos of car accidents and were later asked how fast the cars were going when they hit, collided, or smashed into each other. Just the wording of the question alone changed participants' memories of the event. Those who heard the word smashed estimated higher speeds and were more likely to falsely remember broken glass being on the ground. Our brains will also fill in gaps based on associations of different items. For example, another study demonstrated this particularly well by asking participants to remember a list of the following words. Now, how many people in this study do you think recalled the word sleep as being a part of this list? If you guessed the number was higher than 50%, then you begin to understand what's wrong with this whole paradigm. So, is there any validity to the idea of repression? Well, as we just discussed previously, the idea of repression has been given some scientific credibility across these different studies to try and capture the fundamental idea of what repression is. But the purpose of these studies is to make the idea of repression generalizable to a wider demographic of people to demonstrate how it operates among them. But to answer the question more precisely, we'll try to look at this on a more individual level. So let's create a story. We'll take a fake person that doesn't exist and call him John, and we'll slap him with a nasty bout of alexithymia. Now, alexithymia, also known as emotional blindness, is a perfect example to use here because it maps onto the idea that repressing distressing desires and distressing memories causes us an emotional divorce. And therefore, because of that divorce, we cannot adequately describe our own emotions. Now, if John here has been involved in something horrendous like war or a car crash and has been traumatized, then we'll give him a diagnosis of PTSD. This is because alexithymia occurs in a significantly higher proportion of people who have post-traumatic stress disorder compared to the general population. Not only does alexithymia occur as a potential consequence of emotional repression, but other factors can be involved too, like emotional numbness or the inability to remember events adequately if they were emotionally charged or distressing. Now, there's no neurobiological connection to the idea of repression and emotional numbness in and of itself, but rather what psychoanalysis does is extrapolate from observations made from practitioners, which shows that people have a tendency to avoid distressing content or objects, and then these practitioners relegate that to this unconscious mechanism. For example, you might be skeptical if John told you he couldn't remember how he felt when he lost control of his car. But if he's repressing the feeling in memory because it's genuinely too terrifying, then he's telling the truth, while also protecting himself, because that memory might induce panic or a major depressive episode. And at the upper level of this phenomenon, dissociation begins to come into play in the form of either not knowing where you are, in the case of derealization, or not knowing who you are, in the case of depersonalization. But this is also where we reach the upper limit of our connection to scientific data, because again, there isn't any direct scientific data to support the notion that repression causes dissociation. What you'll find in contemporary research on dissociation may appear very similar at first, because of the overlapping functions, especially when it comes to threats. Our brain can automatically disconnect us from our memory, emotions, sense of self, our environment, or even our somatic feelings. And we understand this pretty well on the neurological level because essentially what happens when you dissociate is your amygdala, which takes a primal role in helping you to remember how you feel during emotionally charged events, is essentially going nuts, and that's causing other additional hormones to spike, including cortisol or adrenaline. And what sometimes happens as a result of this is that other parts of your brain responsible for memory are impaired by these stress hormones, so the memories themselves turn out fragmented. Now again, it might seem like there's a lot of overlap in regards to repression and dissociation, but we still can't draw a concrete connection between the two. Now, one reason for this is that repression rests on the notion that the id, ego, and superego are all quasi-physical parts of your brain that are essentially vying for control. And repression acts as a mediator created by your ego to manage the conflict between your id and your superego. And there's no credible data to suggest that that literal interpretation is true. In order to prove that, you would need to at least start with evidence that the primitive parts of your brain, such as your limbic system, are both conflicting with your executive functions, such as planning or decision making, and demonstrate that there is a neurological correlation to an ego, which is distinct from the two former concepts which mediates them. So in terms of the question, yes, there is some credibility to the idea that repression actually does exist, which has been shown by the overlap of more contemporary research and data that's come out that shows our unconscious minds influence us in all ways possible. Again, the main problem with this isn't the lack of data to support evidence that repression is an unconscious phenomenon. The problem is to be found in the conceptual basis. The concept of repression itself originates from the German word Verdrängung, which means to drive out, which is not definitively happening in reality, as different parts of the brain work together more often than necessarily fighting for control or to rid a distressing stimulus. From the neuroanatomical point of view, it actually seems that these different parts of our brains function in consortium with one another in order to help us mediate our distress, even in the cases of where that leads to dissociative states. So given the overlap between these dynamics, it's reasonable to say that the original psychoanalysts were on the right track, and, with a small conceptual update, repression is likely applicable to all of us. Now when it comes to prevalence, we have to again clarify some differences. The tenets of repression, which primarily circle around dissociation, are a fundamental part of human dynamics. So, these things generally speaking are always occurring all of the time. When we try to extrapolate the consequences of repression is when the prevalence becomes muddied. And that's because repression on its own is neither good nor bad. The delegation of those attributes are more so based on your environment. When a trauma surgeon loses a patient in a difficult operation, they may feel the initial shock followed quickly by overpowering feelings of guilt, self-doubt, and shame, but he must move on to the next surgery as someone's life literally depends on it. Your doctor needs to put away or repress these feelings in order to be able to treat you more adequately. And from his lived experience, there's no notable stress, there's no intrusive thoughts, no impairment in functioning, and no sense that there's something wrong. Now again, speaking on the phenomenological level, this effect is essentially neutral. But the reason this might make us feel uncomfortable is because it doesn't answer some questions about the situation, such as, will he do better next time, or is he going to be okay? But those things pertain more to his personality and surroundings than it does to repression. So, to sum it all up, if we were to rate repression on its validity, prevalence, and likelihood for dysfunctional adaptations, on a scale from 1 to 10, I'd put validity at a 7, prevalence at a 10, and likelihood for dysfunctional adaptations at about a 5, for all of the aforementioned reasons. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and we'll talk more about similar topics in the future.